Hello and welcome to another episode of Adventures in .NET. I'm Sean Klebo, your host, and with me today we've got a full panel. We've got Christian Wenz.
Hello.
Hey, Christian. Adam Permonic. Hey.
Hey, everyone.
And the person at the bottom there, that's Mark.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Mark. So nobody traveling for the holidays? We're recording this just before Christmas weekend. And we're all here. What are we? Are we not sociable people?
I'm leaving tomorrow morning.
Same here. And mind that at least in my neck of the woods, Christmas is celebrated on the 24th. So the 25th is for relaxing after the 24th. The 24th is where it's all happening.
Cool.
I was trying to schedule a meeting with one of my, devs on Monday, and he's like, that's kind of right in the middle of Christmas. And I'm like, what? And I checked the calendar. I'm like, oh, fine. You can have that day off. But I'll be working.
Off, right?
But my family gets so mad at me. They like, you're the worst dad ever. I get a lot of that.
Yes, also for those who are listening to that later on Spotify or any of the other platforms, we're recording today on December the 22nd. And if you only hear the audio, I'm wearing my ugly Christmas sweater for the occasion. And the others are wearing their Christmas haircut for the occasion. So
if you're only listening to the audio, I have my best Christmas haircut ever on right now.
This reminds me of this scene from The Office when Dwight was recording a meeting. That's exactly the same vibe.
All right, I think we have someone else in the room.
Wait, Mark, since you just figured out Monday was Christmas, Mark, did you now need to go out and buy some presents?
I do not buy into the fiction of Christmas, Sean. You're not going to get me with your marketing messages or your, get your ugly sweater on. I'm fighting everybody on this.
Oh, bah humbug.
That's right.
All right, let's bring on that other person Christian was talking about. Let's welcome our guest today. Hey, Brian Chavez.
Hi, thank you for the invite. I'm Brian Chavez.
Yeah,
the author of Bogus. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. We like to start things off, very lightweight and give an introduction to yourself, kind of how you got into development, how you got into .NET, things like that. So why don't you start us off there before we get into Bogus?
Okay, yeah, no problem. So I'm a senior software developer at a company. I work full-time. And I guess kind of how I got started was I knew pretty early back in high school what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with computers. And I could always kind of teach myself a little bit of software. It kind of came natural. But the hardware stuff was a lot more difficult. I couldn't, for the life of me, teach myself how voltage worked and things like that. So in college, I studied computer engineering and got a degree in computer engineering, digital hardware. So it's like, designing PCBs and things like that. And then over that, I kind of really got a better understanding of how computers worked at a kind of an electronic level. And then that kind of progressed into starting a small business right after college, and that's Bit Armory Incorporated. And, I just built, small time business software, and then eventually took a full-time job. And that's kind of during my kind of like early startup days with my small business. I was really heavy into open source, and that's kind of where a lot of this stuff came from, Bogus and things like that. And so that's where I'm at now. It's kind of in a nutshell how it went.
And what
how did you get into the .NET world?
Nope. Oh, in the .NET world, yeah. So back in high school, I tried to create this program called Direct Games because I really love this game called Warzone 2100. It's open source now, and there was back in the early days when it was released. It was owned by a company called Pumpkin Studios, and so they released this game called Warzone. It was kind of like kind of the early genres of StarCraft and things like that, and and it was a really cool game. I loved it, but there was people cheating in it, and people would use these cheat engines that would basically hook a DLL in the program space, in the game space, and poke memory for your health values and things like that to reset the game value. And it was a peer-to-peer, so there was no kind of server overseeing the gameplay or anything like that. So there was a lot of cheating in there, and I really wanted to try to see if I could solve this problem in high school. And so I kind of got hooked into kind of Visual Basic. And so I built a small little server, game server, kind of anti-cheat server. It's basically like a lobby platform, and it would launch the game for you while in the background scanning your process list, making sure there wasn't cheat engines running to cheat in the game. And that worked well, but it didn't work well enough because the server crashed basically right at about 35 users. And at that point in time in high school, I really didn't understand like data structures or anything like that. So kind of, I had to mature a little bit more in that respect. And through college, I learned Java and C and things like that through my coursework. And then kind of towards the tail end of college, I, C# 1.0 dropped and .NET and all this stuff. And I thought it was really cool. And I started looking more into the language, C#, how it was pretty well designed, the APIs. And, it was, I felt there was a lot of productivity I could get out of the language and the developer tooling around it. And so that's kind of how I fell into .NET. And now I'm kind of stuck. I wouldn't say stuck, but I just love .NET now. My full-time job now, when I first got hired full-time, it was doing .NET, but I recently transitioned to a security team doing JavaScript work. So, but I'm still in .NET because of my open source work. So that's kind of how I fell into .NET. I love .NET and C# and always will, I think.
Nice. That was one of the best answers to the "how'd you get here" question we've heard.
I remember cheating in those games, and I was so sad when Windows 7 introduced a thing that was called ASLR, I think, that stopped all those Magic Trainer creators from working. Some good old days.
Yeah. Yeah. Being able to, crush your opponents with, just a click. Those were the days.
I was just playing single-player games back then, so I was just adding some gold and other resources to build more houses. But yeah, that was really cool. But also, it actually poked me in similar direction. I wanted to understand why Magic Trainer creators stopped working in Windows Vista. So I started learning various internals of Windows, and yeah, then I understood, and I was so sad.
Yeah.
I've been known to write a few mining bots, but I used AutoHotkey. It was just an online-based game, and just would run some clients overnight to do some mining, so I get lots of money and things like that. So I'd wake up and I'd be rich. And
you guys are not going to trick me into revealing my crimes on this show. Nice try, both of you. Right, Christian? We're not going to tell them what we're doing on the side.
We better don't. We better don't.
We better don't, for sure.
So our main topic today is your open source project called Bogus. And so how did that get started? And first off, what does it do? And then how did you get started with that project?
Yeah, so Bogus is a fake data generator. It basically helps you build fake data. I think we've all been in that one, sitting in our computer chairs and typing up on our apps, and then we get to the point where we hit F5 and we want to see it work a little bit, and then we'll type in test user 1, test user 2, test user 3, and then that kind of gets a little bit repetitive, and then we get some idea that it's working, but I this was kind of the state of development back then. And I think I was watching a Pluralsight video back in 2015 called Rethink DB Fundamentals by Rob Connery. I think, yeah, it was a long time ago. Back then, MongoDB and these document databases were up and coming, and Rethink DB was an alternative to MongoDB at the time. And so I was learning that course, and I think in one of the modules, he mentioned something about FakerJS and how he was able to populate a database with FakerJS. And I'm like, wow, this is really, really good. We need something like this in .NET. And we also need to connect to RethinkDB natively in .NET. So I built 2 open source projects. One is Bogus, which is a port of FakerJS, and a RethinkDB database driver to connect to RethinkDB. And that and kind of when I was sitting down, I just kind of had this one feeling that .NET needed this, because I've been in that situation so many times writing test user 1, test user 2. It was crazy. So it's just like I just knew that we needed a good solid fake data generator in .NET because of the types of applications that we build, enterprise applications. We want to be able to test our apps with what realistic but fake looking data. And you can kind of get into it because or it gets a little bit further when you build your applications, because test user 1, test user 2, let's say you're building a WinForms application, maybe the margins are just perfect for test user 1 and test user 2 and test user 3. But what happens when you throw in Richard Chavez or Richard Blumenthal or something like that, where it goes just past the margin, and now your UWP or WinForms app is a little bit off, and now you got to try to tinker around with the scroll bars to make sure that the whole name, you can see the whole name and things like that. So when you have synthetic data that looks realistic, it gives you a deeper intuition about how your app is functioning. And it's not just GUI apps, but server applications too. Let's say you're building some SaaS application, and you have your database collation set on some kind of different setting, or you're using varchar instead of nvarchar. Bogus would generate characters with certain dialectics, I believe they're called, and so it'll throw that data at your database, and then when you read it back, those fancy characters with like accent or groove or something like this, it would come back different because the encoding might be different, or just even saving a file, maybe the default is ASCII and when it should be UTF-8 kind of thing. And so you get a lot of those types of feedback when using synthetic data, because it's a little bit more realistic. So that's kind of how it kind of fell together. And there were a lot of fake data generators out there before Bogus, and they were good, but there was, for me, I'm a really big fan of Microsoft's API design. There's actually a book that I have. It's called Framework Design Guidelines, Conventions, Idioms, and Patterns for Reusable .NET Libraries. This book right here is, I think, one of the best books in .NET software development, because it taught me a lot about how to build reusable libraries. And so I lifted a lot of the semantic notions, the API design kind of culture in Microsoft's .NET BCL, and kind of brought that forward into Bogus. And so that's where a lot of the other libraries maybe didn't match up. So that was one aspect. Another aspect was deterministic, repeatable sequences. That was something critically, I think, important, because let's say you did want to populate a database with 1 million rows, 10 million rows, 50 million rows to test your system. You want repeatability. You want determinism built into the framework that you're using. And a lot of the other fake data generators at the time didn't have that. And that's something I wanted to bring forward into this library called Bogus. And back in 2015, I guess, I was just sitting around and wanted to port it over, and I needed to think of a name. And so I was in the NuGet package manager console trying to think of a name, and something funny popped up, Bogus, and I installed -package Bogus. I'm like, okay, you're installing bogus stuff into your application. There you go. So that's kind of how it fell together.
So this is quite a lot, I must say. And I never used Bogus, but I was using AutoFixture. And it was very similar in like, at least how I can imagine. If you were to like compare those two libraries, what would you say? Is there any like advantage in using one of the other?
I would say, use both. I'm not one in particular, use the best tool for the job, I think. I think AutoFixture, I haven't used it too much, but I do know that it generates, like, if you ask it for a string, it would give you like just a regular random string. And I think it's like sometimes even a GUID as a string. And so that's okay. I think it's perfectly has its uses in unit testing. Where you really don't care about the value, you just want to make sure a string is a string. You write it or serialize it and you get it back, type of thing. Whereas with Bogus, if you want, you can use Bogus for unit tests, but you can also use it to, I think, probably the best case is like populating databases or generating kind of more realistic data. Like a person's name would come out Brian Chavez or Matthew McDonald. It would actually generate realistic looking names instead of a GUID for a first name or a last name.
If it spits out my name, I would be very surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah, so the way that kind of works is there's a dictionary underneath the hood. Because it, kind of going back to the design and the build of Bogus, I wanted to leverage FakerJS's community, and I wanted to leverage .NET's community as well. So part of the design and build of Bogus is to not just port over some of the APIs, which can be almost one-to-one matched. There's a little bit of a sprinkle of .NET APIs design standards on top of that. So it might not match parameter for parameter, but they're pretty close. So it's easy to transition between both Bogus and FakerJS. But one of the big design goals I had was to make sure that I could pull down their locale data. So with FakerJS, you could have the English language. You could also have the Arabic language. You could also have the Australian locale. You can have, there's like, I think over 50 locales that you can pick from to generate fake data. So if you were to pick, for example, the Swedish locale, it would generate Swedish type of names instead of, Brian Chavez or something very like English. So in that, how FakerJS stores that information is basically a JSON object or a JSON object in FakerJS. And so porting that locale data into Bogus is something I wanted to keep as part of the design, so that when contributions are made to FakerJS, I wanted to be able to fast forward those contributions also in Bogus, so that so that the Bogus community could also benefit from the FakerJS contributions as well. Yeah.
So how do you keep them in sync? Do you keep them in sync? Do you do it manually, or like what do you do?
Yeah, so it's a tough process. I would say, like, back in the earlier days, like I would, pick a weekend or something like that, and then I would just basically go through the commits up to whatever their release version was, and then pull down the data. Now, that was a tedious process, and that was about where FakerJS was about version 5. And there was a bit of a little riff in the community. We could talk more about that. But FakerJS, there was a kind of like a community takeover to this now kind of newer version of FakerJS. And they were able to carry it from version 5 to version 6, version 7. And I think they're getting close to or at version 8. And so during those major version updates in FakerJS, it also they changed the data format, so it's written in TypeScript now instead of pure JavaScript. So I've had to do quite a bit of kind of automation around that to basically pull out the schema. And basically, I have a test that I just wrote just a couple of days ago that will scan through that JSON schema, and then if there's any changes, I use verify. Simon Kropp's verify library to check that JSON schema. If the geometry of that data changes, I'll be able to know, okay, I can go back and update Bogus's .NET code to handle that geometry change in the JSON.
That's pretty neat, I must say. My first guess was now with LLMs and all the machine learning stuff, like some companies, I think one of the popular video streaming service was banned from using ChatGPT because they were using it to generate training data for their own LLM. So I imagine you could just take FakerJS and ask it, hey, generate 1 million of strings for me, and then, do this thing on those and capture data.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard use cases like that where people would, create, using synthetic data to train AI models with a fake data set and get close to pretty good results, I would say, probably. Yeah.
Did you ever get any complaints that one of the fake names generated was, I don't know, offensive or weird? I'm just thinking about in The Simpsons, that the Bart phone call pranks. Like, I think, what is one I could mention here in this show? Maybe for Oliver Klotzov. Um, that's a common name that shows up, and I mispronounced this intentionally. So anything like that happened, or is this just bread and butter?
Occasionally. Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, occasionally. It doesn't happen very often. But and for when it does happen, I just say, tell the upstream maintainers FakerJS to make any changes, because eventually I'll pull them down.
Okay.
And Bogus does have an extend, basically a data extension. So part of that initial design of being able to copy FakerJS's locale data into Bogus and get it updated is the ability to also merge our custom data if we want to mutate that data as it comes in. There's a process of merging their JSON with our custom JSON. So sometimes there'll be locales or people in the Bogus community in .NET that would want to update their own locale with maybe VIN numbers or something like that. And potentially, it's only useful in maybe Great Britain or something like that. So we have an extension ability to basically patch the JSON that's coming in downstream from FakerJS, and then basically you have almost like a superset of synthetic data with FakerJS and Bogus's and .NET's data. So there is a process for fixing things like that if we need to.
So how much time do you spend on like maintaining your library, keeping it up to date, updating dependencies? How much time a month does it take you?
When I got my full-time job, that changed quite a bit. Back when I was working on my small business, it wasn't too bad. I got to this point where there were very little bugs known at the time, and when that bug did come in, I would fix it and tag the repo, and that was it. And so I had a very fast release cadence, and I think in some ways that also helped with the community, because they were able to gain a little bit of trust. Like, oh, this maintainer, he's got it down to where a bug comes in, he fixes it, tags the repo, and a release is out the door. Within 24 hours, kind of thing. And then when I took a full-time job, I did have to step away from my open source work, but I still work on it as much as I can, and without burning out. After work and on weekends. And I would say, I've pulled back quite a bit, but I still keep it up. Like right now, I've been on PTO since the 7th of this month, and so I've been casually working on it. And so that's what I try to do is, I try to keep it fun for me. And, I try not to burn out. If I ever get into that kind of state, I'll pull back and, come back later on it.
That's a wise approach, I guess. You mentioned, because I'm curious now. You mentioned some issues or discussions within the FakerJS project. So I just checked. So that version 8 you mentioned, that came out in May 2023, but they're now at 8.3 something. So there is still some progress being made. So what went on there, and how did it affect your project, apart from the changed schema, of course, which is weird. That this happens.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, so yeah, no, it's an excellent question. So originally, I think one of the original creators of FakerJS, I think his name was Marak. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but there's a statement on faker.dev or fakerjs.dev where they kind of go into more detail about this. But basically, something happened, I think, with Marak's repository, where he intentionally, I think he was the author and maintainer of Colors JS and FakerJS, and he intentionally sabotaged his repository with, he deleted his code and put in a message in the output console. And so it was kind of like I don't know, an upstream supply chain attack type of thing where he kind of intentionally destroyed his repository. And so, bogus users, obviously I have to manually update that. And so when I saw that, I'm like, something's going on over there. So I'm going to stay out of it. But the community basically got together and was able to fork his repository before he kind of sabotaged it, and basically came up with the current pointer that we point to now upstream, which is the FakerJS community's version instead of Merak's version. So that's basically what happened. Yeah, I guess he wasn't getting paid, I think, for his open source work, or he got upset about it, and he quit, basically, I think.
I think he put in an infinite loop, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, but what was I still remember that I think the combined number of weekly downloads of ColorJS and FakerJS was, I think, 30 million. Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I do a lot of web security, right? So I always tell people, yeah, I mean, you have to stay up to date. But of course, everyone who doesn't look at things and doesn't have automated testing in place, they just run an npm upgrade, whatever, early Monday morning, and then out of a sudden the application ceases working, right? So that's
Yeah, exactly. And even in the .NET space, we don't run JavaScript in Bogus, so if we just copy the JSON locale data, which is that's the only thing we care about. But when I did see that, I'm like, something's going on. But I'm glad that the community got together and was able to revive the repository and was able to carry it forward from version 5 to now version 8. And so now I've been kind of catching up on my PTO to try to catch up to their current version.
excellent.
Brian, I've got a question about your favorite aspect of the API or the architecture that gives you the most power and the most easy to read statement and the least amount of effort. What are you most excited about for you with this?
Yeah. So in the Bogus README, I kind of give like three flavors you could use Bogus. The first one is to use kind of like a Fluent syntax, and I kind of borrowed that from Fluent validation, where we kind of build validation rules for validating our DTOs as they come in and process them. So there's a very similar feel to, you have some kind of domain models, you have some kind of C# object, and you can build rules from those properties. Just like if you were building, validation rules for your domain object, you'd build data population rules for your object for later persistence in a database. So there's that top level Faker Fluent. I call it Faker T, which is the angle brackets T for the generic object. So there's that Faker T level. Then there's kind of the Faker facade level, where you just say new Faker, and you store that in a variable, and you have basically access to all the data sets that are available. And that's kind of like very similar usage and pattern to FakerJS, because that's what you do in FakerJS as well. Is you just call the main Faker function, and you basically get this thing with a whole bunch of properties on it that are the data sets. And it's the same exact thing in Bogus, where you say new Faker without the T generic, and that'll give you access to all the methods that you can call to generate fake data. You can generate pictures, avatars, links to people's avatars. So instead of having like a silhouette picture in your UI app, you could actually generate a UI face for that person. And then kind of like the lowest level that you can get into with Bogus is using a data set directly. And I would say, to answer your question, kind of the most comfortable way is use all of them. The high level goal is to not get your data generation code mangled. And sometimes Faker T, because you could really push it to where, let's say you have one object and then another nested object that it references, and then another nested object that it references. And Faker T rules and Fluent syntax doesn't really kind of fit in that puzzle. And I've seen people create some pretty crazy, Faker T objects where they've got fluent rules that are nested, that go into another nest, that go into another nest, and it's it could be really hard to debug. And so I guess the point is the faker, the regular faker, the new faker object, that level, that mid-level tier, I would say when you just say new faker object without the T, and there's no fluent syntax, and you just have a factory function, and you just use that faker object, I think is usually scales pretty well to very large complex graphs. And so I just use the faker T sparingly. I mean, it's there, but I think, we all have this kind of natural sense of when things get complicated, and that's when you can switch gears from faker T to just using just the regular faker object. So that's kind of how I think about it.
So is there a way to create, or not create, but to have it a guard for creating real data? I could see, like, you don't want it to create a real email address, so your system doesn't accidentally send out an email to somebody that's not expecting it, or maybe phone numbers or addresses or things like that. So is there a way to put some sort of guard in there for that?
Yeah, so it's basically up to the developer. I'm waiting for the case or the GitHub issue that comes in that says that I received a whole bunch of, UPS packages at my doorstep because, the test data was used in production or something like this. I'm waiting for that GitHub issue to appear, but it hasn't yet so far. But it's possible that, Bogus could generate a real name. It could generate a real address. It could generate a real, Android user ID. It could generate a real Bitcoin address. It could. I mean, I think zooming out, it would be limited to basically the random seed space. Basically, I think at some point, and whatever data sets that we pull in from FakerJS. So it's possible that it could generate something, but I haven't heard a report of it yet. And there's nothing to protect it.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. There's nothing to protect you from using the synthetic data in production. And if you do use it in production, I mean, be careful, because it is potentially could be real.
I could see some, like, configuration that says, please do not use any your existent domains, only use something that doesn't exist or something like that. That's what I was thinking.
I was kind of peeking in that direction as well. So how you do a random email address? Are they all at example.com, or how do you do phone numbers?
Yeah, so I think in our data set and the EN locale from FakerJS as well, they do have Gmail addresses. They do have the domain Gmail. They also have the Yahoo domain and other various ones. But you can, as part of Bogus's API, specify a domain if you wanted to. So if you have a test domain, or you just want to make something that is black holed, you're certainly welcome to do that in Bogus. And I give you the APIs to do it. So it's not just you're just using FakerJS, but like I mentioned before, there's a little bit of sprinkling of .NET on top of those APIs so that you can kind of mutate the data a little bit more to your needs.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I mean, with email addresses, I mean, with example.com and example.org, etc. I mean, we do have, a dedicated test bed basically. But yeah, it absolutely makes sense to kind of replace it, for instance, with the customer's domain or something, or the domain of the company that does the web application. And I think phone numbers are harder. I mean, the US has the 555 city code. Is it a city code? I don't even know, but yeah, 555. But not most countries just don't have that, designated made for Hollywood fake phone number scheme. So would be hard to pull off, right? Unless I mean, even if the phone number is too long, I mean, still it could be valid, and the remaining digits would be ignored, and so.
Yeah, and like I said, even with phone numbers, you do have the ability to specify a format. So if you wanted to prefix it with 555, you're certainly welcome to do that. But by default, Bogus will try to get the most realistic kind of looking telephone address as possible for its users.
So you also have a commercial offering for Bogus. Tell us what are we getting?
Oh yeah. So oh yeah. So I do make money from my open source, and part of it was I was kind of trying to think back in the early days, maybe if I could get support from the community, and I decided to create data extensions that augment the current FakerJS data set. So you could potentially have, let's say, Hollywood. Let's say you're building a, a movie app or something like that, and you wanted a list of all the movies. There would be a paid extension that would plug into Bogus to augment the data set with movies, actors, and things like that. Or let's say you're building a healthcare application, and in these types of industries, it's very heavily regulated here with patient data in the United States. So um, there's an extension called Bogus Healthcare that will extend and augment data to generate ICD-9 diagnostic codes. It'll generate, you know, different types of vitamins, blood types, diseases, and things like that. So you could potentially use Bogus to generate patient data for healthcare applications instead of using, heavily regulated data as test data or something like this. Because we all know that something happens somewhere where you're able to get data just to test your app or debug something. Well, you could potentially use Bogus to kind of fill that gap instead of putting patient data or healthcare data at risk. You could use Bogus to kind of deal with that. And so there are paid extensions, and I've sold licenses to small developers to all the way up to governments. So it's pretty well used, and so that's one aspect is the paid extensions. The other aspect, excuse me, the data extensions. There's another extension that I built that's also paid, which is the analyzer. And so basically what it does is when you're using the Faker T object and you're using that fluent syntax for building like a rule for your property and then what to generate, maybe the first name, and then a rule for the last name property, and then how to generate that. Well, what happens if you add middle name to your object model? Well, now your middle name doesn't have a rule defined for that middleware property string in your domain class. And so what this analyzer does is it'll go and read all your Faker T objects and examine if there are any rules that are potentially missing from your domain object, and potentially cause a compiler error and say, hey, you forgot to add a rule for example, the middle name that you just added. You should probably fill that in with some fake data as well. So yeah.
So is this then an analyzer that works in Visual Studio or also in Visual Studio Code or Rider? How is that implemented?
In the link to, I think I have a link to a wiki, I think, on my GitHub repo, and I list out all the IDEs that it works in. And it's a regular C# analyzer, just like all the other analyzers in .NET. There's nothing too special about it, although you do need a license, and my paid extensions are closed source. So you do need a license to use it. But it does, as far as I know, work on all the IDEs: Visual Studio Code, and JetBrains Writer. Yeah, all the major ones, I think.
And how much are we talking for this extensions?
Yeah, it's right now it's $10 for 1 year, so it's renewable. And if you don't like it, you stop using it, send me an email. I'll cancel it. That's it.
Very affordable. Very affordable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that really impresses me is all the different categories of data that it can generate. We're talking about strings and addresses and phones like that, but there's so many different things that you can tell it to do. Business type stuff, finance type stuff, internet stuff, image, whatever. So there's just a humongous list of this stuff. That's great.
So how, if you can answer that, because I know it's a for pay extension, but how do you source the fake data or the basis for the fake data for those extensions? So is it a mix of public data or data you assemble together? Do you watch all seasons of House MD to get a list of, well, there's only Lupin
Yeah.
actually, but yeah, a list of all the diseases. Can you
Yeah.
give us
Yeah,
some?
no,
Yeah.
yeah, I've had to ask for permission and for various sources. Some things you have to ask for, and then some things that are public open data. The federal government has quite a few data sets available for things. They have orange books, blue books, brown books, and things like that. And so, that's where I would look for to see, if I was building an app in an industry, what kind of data would I try to need. And so I would go and look at these open data sets and see if there's anything I could extract from them that I could repackage that's usable.
So the locale for those extensions is ENUS essentially, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably a question of the size of the market always, right?
Yeah. Also, too, I only understand English, so it's hard to create data for other locales that I'm not native in. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the problems that we had when we were working on CodeRush a few years ago is we would have customers who would report an issue that we couldn't reproduce. And we couldn't get their source code for a lot of reasons because CodeRush works on other people's source code. And one of the ideas I had was, well, we could get a description of their source code. In other words, how many classes, how big the files were, how many methods, right? In other words, get data get a rough picture of what the data looks like, then basically create fake data on our side to fill the whole thing in an effort to try to reproduce. And when I think about that and I think about Bogus, I imagine that, it might be useful in some scenarios, maybe, right? Where a customer has got a particular hard to reproduce problem, like for example, maybe performance issues, something like that, to be able to build into the app an ability to describe the data, send it back, right? A small description of it, and then you feed that into, you've got a utility on the other side that feeds it into Bogus and creates something that looks just like what the customer had, or something close to it. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's useful or not. I'm not a database developer at all, but it's something that's kind of interesting when I think about this kind of hard to reproduce problem that's out there.
Yeah, I think you actually hit on a really good point, because I've seen some activity out there, because I do keep an eye on how Bogus is used and things like that, and I have seen some tools where they would layer an anonymizer on top of the data that they process or take out from a secure environment like production. They would layer in some type of an anonymizer process, and Bogus is kind of bolted onto that to kind of anonymize, potentially, social security numbers, email addresses, and things like that, where you're using the fake synthetic data generator and repopulating that data when you're exporting it out for potential PII information or something like that. I've seen some tools start to go in that direction. It's interesting take.
It's cool. I like it.
Is Bogus compatible with all versions of .NET?
Yeah, so we go back, I think the lowest TFM that we support is .NET Full Framework 4.0, I believe. That's what I still compile down to, all the way up to .NET 8, I believe. We ship with the Net 6.0 TFM, but when you load it into a project, it uses the Net 6 build, I believe, in your .NET 8 project. And the reason we do that is because we also want to support time only and date only. So there's some new data types that we want to generate.
Right.
So if the .NET version is supported, you support it.
Yeah,
right?
pretty much.
So once what's next? So when .NET 7 goes out of support in May, then you'll stop looking at .NET 7, more or less, right?
Potentially.
So you're not making it, incompatible. But
no.
it's going out of the test bench.
Yeah, I think, at least for me, I think part of why Bogus is successful is because of the broad support. Even .NET 4.0 projects can use it. I mean, you're not going to get the latest and greatest, .NET types like datetime only, but you could still use it in very legacy applications and projects. And I think it's just me and my personal feeling that it is important to support those types of legacy because it's not too much work on my side to make sure that it compiles or builds. It's just an if-def statement somewhere, and I'm not too crazy into bolting down into some API that's not super compatible. There's no crazy dependencies that Bogus has other than the .NET runtime. So there's not too much that we kind of, in terms of API surface, that we touch that would be really hard to maintain. But yeah, it's .NET 4 is the lowest, and you should be able to use it. It's .NET Standard compatible too. So
your latest release is only a couple weeks ago. You're version 35 now. What kind of things are you working on for version 36 and beyond?
yeah, so lots of stuff. There's probably one of the most requested features is getting resynced up to FakerJS's data locales. I've had quite a few requests for like the Swedish locale to get updated. I think there's a couple more in there. So I have a whole kind of handful of tickets that I need to resolve by getting that pushed forward. And so right now it's, I'm doing some small changes because I'm trying to, I'm on PTO now. I'm getting back into the swing of things. It's been a while. So slowly getting that merged in. Another one is date time transition, DST transitions. You can potentially generate, there's one bug currently that would allow you to generate a date and a time that technically isn't valid for your time zone because of the algorithm that we're using. And one potential fix, we have a PR in the wings that will potentially get merged in that will hopefully solve that problem. And also another important one is right now, when you think about deterministic data and using Bogus, you basically have a seed, but what about time? Time with generating dates in the past based on a seed is also, you have to have an anchor in time to start your seed from. You can't just kind of anchor it to now because now is always changing. So you have to pick an anchor point in some time in the past and then do your calculations based on that seed, either forward or backward. So you have to have some type of time anchor. And right now the API design is a static one. So if you would anchor your time statically with a static field and property, and we all know that that's kind of a bad pattern because it would be better if you could set that time anchor instance on the Faker object itself instead of a statically one, because your code base might be pretty large and you might need static. You might not need static in a different part of your code, and that kind of messes things up in your unit tests. So trying to pull that code, refactor that code out so that it works. Time anchors only happen within the context of a Faker object is basically what we're going to be working on pretty soon too. And that kind of leads to even a bigger issue is how do you keep deterministic data deterministic in the face of updating locales? And that's a whole nother issue. But yeah, we can get into that if you want.
Wow, that is an issue.
Yeah. It's so the versioning. That's why it's at version 35 is because it kind of does and kind of doesn't follow semantic versioning. The biggest thing for me is that if there is any of my tests that break, and they were deterministic unit tests, if they break, then I'm probably breaking someone else. So that's a signal for me to increment the major version number, say, hey, I'm letting the community know that potentially either I updated a locale and they changed the arrays values or the order of those array values, then potentially, I have to do a major increment because I consider breaking determinism as a breaking change. So that's why it's at version 35 right now, is because, we've had quite a few deterministic changes break things. So, yeah.
So is there anything we haven't covered about Bogus that our listeners should know about?
No, it's a cool project.
It sounds cool.
Yeah, it's a cool project. There's not too much more than that. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there that people can create, or that people have created. And I think Nick Chavez, I think, a YouTuber out there, he made a video on Bogus, so there's a lot of learning material out there. Also, I might be doing another podcast in April, but we'll see. Yeah, so yeah, just lots of things to learn about it. And if you have trouble, you can always, create a GitHub issue, or the discussions tab is also open. And I try to get to them when I can, but I do have a full-time job, so it's hard sometimes. But yeah, I do try to.
We have to get more premium subscriptions so you don't have to have that
There-
full-time job. There you go.
There you go. That's one way to do it. Yeah.
For the number of downloads you had for that, if you just have, a premium subscription for just 10% of those, you'd be pretty good.
I think so. Yeah, 'cause I think what's the download number? That's 61 or 62 million downloads.
62 million, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. With that said, I think we'll move on to picks. Let's go. Christian, why don't you start us off with picks?
I will. So as we're recording this a few days before Christmas, I thought about Christmas-themed picks. So for those who are listening into this podcast briefly after recording or are joining us live on LinkedIn or YouTube, there are many Santa trackers, right? So where you see where Santa is, and you can report sightings and stuff. And it's always it always takes me some time to get into solstice mood, but this helps me. And of all of the Santa trackers, I prefer the one Google is doing because they use a lot of gamification, and that's also quite nice fun. And if you're listening to this after the holidays, then I just recommend you watch probably the most traditional Christmas movie there is, and that's Die Hard 1. Because Die Hard, I think it came out in summer, but it takes place on Christmas. So there's no better way than celebrate Christmas if you celebrate Christmas with Die Hard, and if you don't celebrate Christmas, watch Die Hard. I think it's a movie that aged quite gracefully.
Yeah, I just watched it. So to me, it's a Christmas movie. Yep.
See?
Christmas music, Christmas setting, all that kind of stuff.
You can't err with that one.
All right. So Adam, what's your pick?
So my pick for this week is continuing virtualization in Android. And recently Google announced that Android virtualization framework is going to be a part of Android 14 and onwards, meaning that virtualization is going more and more into mobile devices. So probably we'll have some brand new areas where we can actually hack things and deal with security. That's for Christian. And obviously do some fancy stuff like running Windows on Android or Mac OS on Android, because why not? So I highly encourage you to take a look at that, the design and what's gonna change in Android, and just looking forward to what the future is gonna bring in terms of what I'll be able to run on my mobile phone.
Okay. Mark, you're next.
Well, I tried watching Rebel Moon, and the first 30-40 minutes of it are not great. It starts to pick up. I realize I have the most empathy for the character I have the most empathy for is the robot. And the robot is emoting better than a lot of the other actors around.
It's the best actor in the show, right? So
I wanted it to be great, and so far not. It's picking up a little. There's some interesting things. But I was hoping I was going to be able to bring that, and I'm not. All I got for you kids is GPT-4 1106 preview. I asked it a math question the other day because I'm always curious to see, how they're doing over there. And it stunned me with the answer. I basically said, look, I've got 4 numbers in this pattern. They're 4, 11, is that right? 4, 11, no, sorry. 3, 10, 21, and 40 are the sequence. What's going on? How do I predict it? Was essentially the question. And it comes back saying, hey, you know what? You've got some polynomial options to pursue this. If you look at a polynomial of order 3, because you've got 4 items in here, you can solve it. And basically comes back with a solution that's impressive. Now, where did I get these 4 numbers from? The 4 numbers come from a test that my son is doing in math, and he's like, I think this fourth number is wrong in the pattern. I can't get it to fit. And he presents that to me. I run it through. I say, look at this. Take this whole. Look at the answer. We've got the polynomial coefficients all the way here, and it works. They're weird coefficients. One of them's 25/3, for example. However, we switch it to the number he suggested, and the whole thing just collapses and simplifies into something like 2n squared plus 2, or something like that. And the experience with it, I was very impressed. I keep hearing people say there's no reasoning power inside of here. There's no ability to do math yet. And yet I'm seeing evidence that the math is strong. And I think it's going to get significantly stronger as we move forward. Anyway, that's it.
But you can now do images and things like that, all sorts of things in ChatGPT now.
Yeah, one of the also interesting options here is they've got support for code interpreter as well. You can just turn that on or off. So it's, from my perspective, I deeply appreciate this option. So yeah, we're definitely going in kind of a cool direction. Related to all of this, the ousting for a moment of Sam Altman. Did you guys hear about this? We probably don't have time to talk about this at all, but it was reportedly because of some top secret stuff inside that people thought was going to take over the world.
I saw it, but I didn't dig into it that much.
Don't dig into it, kids. It's going to be scary.
Yeah. One thing I saw that was really cool that Microsoft is doing is that it'll actually generate your Git check-in comments now for you. So
yeah, we're actually doing this in CodeRush. I think I told you about this. We've actually got XML.comment generation using ChatGPT, basically the OpenAI engine, and we are modifying. I say we've got that. We're not shipping that yet. I'm the only person who's using that feature right now, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. The biggest problem we have with it is it's got phantom exceptions that it talks about. It says it raises this exception, and I'm like, no, it doesn't, like that. And so I got to go after that. But other than that, I used it just today, and I was really impressed with how fast it generated a reasonable comment about what the code did.
Oh, so that's XML comments. You always talk about your Git, when you check in your code.
Right.
Instead of just saying, blah, 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 whatever,
Right,
generic.
but I guess what I'm saying is
describe with changes that you did now.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about basically the same thing, even though one's bigger. They're essentially analyzing the code and describing what's happened, analyzing the changes, describing what's happened. Yeah, I think we're moving towards a space where the tooling, I think, is going to get really, really good. I'm using in practice every day. I'm using OpenAI cognitive services to write code. And the results are getting better and better. So,
cool.
So I'm really liking it.
All right. So my pick this week is Reacher Season 2 on Amazon TV. So I really loved, he's just such a badass,
Sean,
but he's a good guy.
Sean,
trying to help people out.
Sean, I can't watch shows with people have big muscles. My wife looks at me and like, what is that? And I don't know. It's a muscle suit. Don't look at me like I'm
camera
like,
angles.
It looks unnatural. I think there is some CGI taking
No,
place.
we do.
That guy.
I just read an article. They're purposely putting camera angles and other people that are next to him in positions that make them seem small compared to him. And
yeah, probably with a wide angle lens too, right? And they get really close to him. Right, yeah. Everybody else looks tiny. Yeah, I keep trying to explain it to my wife, but boy, you're making it hard and hard with these picks, Sean. Can we get like a young Sheldon or something from you?
All right, I'll try to come up with something next week. All right, Brian, do you have a pick for our audience?
I'll probably maybe mention another open source project called Simple Injector. I think that open source project, it's basically a DI container. I really love that Simple Injector DI container. I know Microsoft has a DI container now, but before Microsoft, I was a big fan of Simple Injector. And, if you're building a small app or console application or command line application, and you need a basic DI container, I think Simple Injector is a really good choice. That's it.
Okay,
Excellent.
great.
Thank you very much for coming, Brian.
Yeah, thanks so
Yeah.
much for having me.
Fantastic show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks,
And
Brian.
if our listeners have comments with feedback for the show, they love to hear from you. They can get me on all the platforms, even Blue Sky now. I finally got invited into Blue Sky. So
You could have asked me. And I would have more than one friend, really.
all right. Yep. So at .NET Superhero. Catch me on wherever you want. Thanks, everybody. And we'll catch our listeners on the next episode of Adventures in .NET.